Hello, dear friends, and welcome to part 3 of our softly spoken read-through of the British Kings and Queens. A lovely little book, actually, that gives us a pocket history on every single monarch that ever was, from the moment the monarchy began, post the fall of the Roman Empire. Part 3 sees us start with Henry II Cerdmantle, who was the first of the House of Plantagenet. Now this is the first of who I consider to be the classical kings and queens when you associate English medieval kingdoms. This is the first who I think comes to mind, and the Plantagenet are a powerful household that have their ancestral roots in many families today. And Henry was the first Plantagenet king and one of the most successful and powerful kings in English history. As the beneficiary of 3 enormous dynasties, he ruled lands from the Solway further in the north to the Pyrenees in the south. He was the son of Geoffrey Plantagenet, Geoffrey V of Anjou, and Matilda of England, and was born in Le Mans, southwest France. He was brought up in Anjou and at age 9 was taken to Bristol in England to continue his education. When he was only 19 years old, in 1152, he quietly married Eleanor of Aquitaine in Bordeaux Cathedral on May the 18th, 1152. The reason for this discretion was only 6 weeks previously, Eleanor had had her marriage to King Louis VII of France annulled on the grounds of consanguinity. They were already estranged, and Louis was desperate for a male heir. Although about 11 years older, Eleanor was a prize catch, as since the age of 15 she had become the wealthiest woman in Europe, the heiress to Aquitaine, the largest and richest province of France. Here is an image of Henry leading his wife, the Eleanor of Aquitaine, and son Richard into captivity after the 1173 revolt, from a fresco in Chinon, a statue of Henry II at Lichfield Cathedral. So over the years of their tempestuous marriage, which was even more consanguineous than her previous marriage, they had 5 sons and 3 daughters. William, who died aged 2.5. Henry, the young king, died of dysentery in 1183. Richard, who became Richard the Lionheart. Geoffrey died aged 28 in Paris. John, who became King John I, and Matilda, who married Henry the Lion, Duke of Saxony and Bavaria. Eleanor and Joan. In addition, Henry complicated matters further by fathering a number of illegitimate children, and that's why you find many people in ancestry shows in the UK, such as Who Do You Think You Are? Very surprising people are connected back to the Plantagenet line. So from his father he inherited Maine and Anjou. From his mother he received Normandy. And when he married Eleanor, he added control, though not ownership, which remained hers, of Aquitaine and Gascony, which made him Louis VII's most powerful and feared vassal. Through Matilda, his mother, he had a strong claim to the throne of England too, so he journeyed to England at the head of an army 3 times, in 1147, 1149 and 1150 without success, until in January 1153 he arrived on the south coast with 36 ships and 3,000 soldiers. With popular support, he managed to secure King Stephen's agreement to make him his heir with the Treaty of Wallingford. Stephen died in 1154, October, and Henry became the king at the age of 22. Already well versed in the deadly games of intrigue and diplomacy, he was crowned at Westminster Abbey on December the 19th, 1154. So as king, his first job was to reunite the kingdom so ineptly ruled by Stephen and suffering from the divisiveness of the Civil War. He started tearing down rebel castles that had been built by rogue barons and imposed a new tax known as scutage, by which means the barons who had got used to avoiding military service paid instead for the king to hire mercenaries to do the fighting for them, without any danger of the barons becoming too powerful and turning on the king. Realizing that the key to good governance was real justice and fair laws, he set about reforming English law with the help of his Chancellor Thomas Becket. and he consequently has been credited as the founder of English common law. In the Assizes of Clarendon in 1166, he established a new procedure for criminal justice, establishing the royal magistrate courts that gave appointed court officials the power to adjudicate in the name of the crown on local matters, new prisons for people awaiting trial, and the first juries started to pronounce on legal matters. Local sheriffs became appointed agents with powers to enforce the law and collect taxes across the land. By 1158, he'd restored much of the royal power and retrieved once lost lands. He was physically imposing, loved hunting, but was a man of letters and scholarly debate as well. He was feared for his volcanic and sudden temper, and would sit on his councils whenever possible, and enjoyed the intricacies of the law. The church was a thorn in his side, so he sought to limit its control and reduce the interference from the Pope and his advisors. He increasingly authorized the use of secular courts for dealing with ecclesiastical disputes, but the new Archbishop of Canterbury, his one-time Chancellor and great friend, Thomas Becket, refused to ratify Henry's proposals and attempted to block any increase of royal power over church affairs. He fled to France under the protection of Louis VII, when Henry ordered him to appear before the Royal Council to explain himself, and only returned in 1170 when Henry promised that he wouldn't punish him. But he was still infuriated by this, and it has gone down in history, shouted out in anger, "Who will rid me of this turbulent priest?" Possibly misinterpreting his intentions, 4 of his knights, Hugh de Morville, Richard le Breton, William de Tracy, and Reginald Fitzurse, rode out for Canterbury on December the 29th, 1170. They found Becket in the cathedral and beat him to death on holy ground. It's quite a famous incident in English history. Henry was remorseful and denied any intention for harm to come to his former friend. He was compelled by the popular backlash against the murder to sign the Compromise of Avranches, which relinquished all secular jurisdiction over to the clergy, and within 3 years Pope Alexander III declared Becket a saint and martyr for the church. An Irish dissident and minor prince was driven off his lands in Leinster and appealed to Henry II for help. This suited Henry's political ambitions, and he restored him to his lands, and in 1171 declared himself Lord of Ireland, a title he later gave to his son John, so starting an 800 years of English domination of Ireland. A few years later, in 1174, King William the Lion of Scotland invaded northern England at the same time as a Flemish armada was threatening the south. Henry, seeing the hand of an angry god in the threats, made for Canterbury, where he did penance for the murder of Archbishop Thomas Becket. The armada dispersed without landing, and Henry sent his army north to face the Scottish invaders. The armies met at the Battle of Alnwick. King William was captured, and the Scots routed, leaving Henry with control over southern Scotland. Now his troubles came from his immediate family, all of whom quarrelled incessantly and violently. Dubbed the Angevin curse, his problem was how to divide his lands and wealth among his children in such a way that each would be satisfied with their portion and not wage war on each other. His second son, Richard, refused to submit to Henry's nominated successor, young Henry, his older brother, and both wanted their inheritance immediately. They rebelled, encouraged by Queen Eleanor, but were quickly crushed by their father. Eleanor was punished by being placed under house arrest for the next 16 years of her life. In 1182, young Henry, Richard and Geoffrey, each encouraged by Philip Augustus of France, began fighting each other for their father's French territories. But in June, young Henry suddenly died. The threat dissipated until 1184, when Geoffrey and John invaded Aquitaine, only to be defeated by their brother Richard. And in the next couple of years, Geoffrey died and John clearly became his father's favourite and possibly nominated successor. Fearing the loss of his due inheritance as oldest son, Richard allied with Philip Augustus, and together in 1189 successfully invaded Anjou. In defeat, Henry II was forced to agree to all their demands, reinstating Richard as heir and paying homage to Philip Augustus for his French possessions. He was now 56 years old, ill and deserted by almost all his family, and he died at Chinon Castle at July the 6th, 1189, from where he was taken to be buried at nearby Fondrevaux-l'Abbey. He'd spent 21 years of his reign in his French territories and only 13 in England. And then that leads us on, of course, to his heir, Richard I, Lionheart, Coeur de Lion, the House of Plantagenet ruled from the 1189 to 1199. So he was called the Coeur de Lion for his bravery and fighting spirit. He was commanding his father's army at the age of 16, and he proved an expensive monarch. Before becoming king, he repeatedly campaigned against both his father and his brother for lands, particularly in France. And although burningly ambitious to be rich and powerful after becoming king, he was happy to leave his lands under the control of others while he went to fight in foreign lands. He was born into the notoriously quarrelsome and jealous family at Beaumont Palace in Oxford, and his parents separated. He stayed with Eleanor, who gave him her duchy in 1168, then Poitiers in 1172. In spring 1174, Richard joined causes with his brothers John and Geoffrey, and as we found out earlier, rebelled against their father. When Henry II died in 1189, Richard became King of England, Duke of Normandy and Count of Anjou, and was crowned at Westminster Abbey on September 13th, 1189. But he longed to go on crusade and fight for the return of the Holy Land. In 1187, Saladin had captured the holy city of Jerusalem. When the Third Crusade was raised to counter his victory, Richard was determined to join. Across the Channel, King Philip also agreed to go. To pay for the crusade, Richard spent most of the money in the treasury, then raised taxes and sold various local offices, official positions, lands and rights until he had sufficient funds to leave England in 1190. He is reported to have said, "I would have sold London if I could find a buyer." The governance of England was left largely in the hands of his mother, Eleanor of Aquitaine, and his French lands in various hands, most notably William Fitzralph, who was appointed Seneschal of Normandy. Here is a statue of Richard I near the Houses of Parliament in London, and here is a painting of Richard I on crusade. Here is an image of the bowman that would eventually fire the arrow that would kill Richard I at Challis. And here is the ornate burial, buried at Fontevraud Abbey near Chinon in Anjou, once the resting place of many of his family. And today only the effigies of Henry II, Eleanor, and, as seen here, Richard and Isabella, the wife of his younger brother John, can be seen. So in the Crusades, Richard left England with a fleet of 100 ships, carrying 4,000 men-at-arms and 4,000 foot soldiers. They occupied and pacified Sicily, and by May they had arrived in Cyprus, which Richard conquered. He then married Berengaria, the daughter of King Sancho VI of Navarre, and by June 1191 he arrived in the Holy Land. In July he captured the great castle at Acre, and in the September Richard succeeded at Arsuf, and the Crusaders were able to take Jaffa. He never set foot in Jerusalem, though. Aside of fighting the infidel, the various national contingencies, French, German, and English, continually fell out with each other. A year's stalemate followed, and Richard reached a truce with Saladin, packed up, and returned home. Back in Western Europe, Philip II Augustus attempted unsuccessfully to take possession of Richard's French territories, and in England his brother John occupied Windsor Castle and prepared an invasion force of Flemish mercenaries. However, Queen Eleanor responded by prizing oaths of allegiance from the barons and strengthening the garrisons across the country. It's during this period that the stories of Robin Hood are set, of course Robin Hood returning from the Crusades. Richard's journey was not easy. A storm drove his ship ashore near Aquileia in the Adriatic near Venice, and he was imprisoned by Leopold of Austria, who soon handed him over to Henry VI, the Holy Roman Emperor. In 1193, Henry ransomed Richard for the enormous sum of 150,000 silver marks. The money was raised, and in February 1194, Richard was released and rushed to England, where he was crowned for a second time at Winchester to reinforce his authority and assure his people of his independence from foreign influence. Within a month, he journeyed to Normandy to inspect his French territories and never again returned to England. Richard I spent his next 5 years intermittently fighting against Philip II Augustus. His final battle was the siege of Challis in central France, where he received a fatal wound and died on April 6, 1199. He was the king of England for 10 years, barely spoke English, and spent a total of only 6 months in England, while king. We now have John I Lackland, ruled 1199 to 1216. Here's the Victorian impression of John, and a beautiful 14th century manuscript illustration showing King John stag hunting. Here is an image of his tomb in Worcester Cathedral. The marble sarcophagus lid effigy dates to about 1240 and is believed to be the earliest portrait of an English king. The rest of the tomb dates from the 1540s. So the son of King Henry II, and as we know, the younger brother of Richard, John was born at Beaumont Palace and rebelled against his father. In October 1190, Richard named his nephew Arthur, their brother Geoffrey's son, as his heir instead of John, so infuriating the latter that when Richard was away on the Third Crusade, John attempted a royal coup. His mother, Eleanor, defended her absent son's possessions, but the brothers reconciled on Richard's return, and when Arthur was captured by Philip II Augustus, Richard named John as his heir. In 1189, John married Isabel of Gloucester. They had no children, and John successfully applied for an annulment on the grounds of consanguinity around the time he became king. The next year, in August, John kidnapped and married his second wife, how charming, the Isabella of Angoulême, from her betrothed Hugh de Lusignan. Together they had 2 sons and 3 daughters, although John had numerous illegitimate children as well. Deeply insulted, the Lusignans rebelled and appealed to Philip II Augustus for help. He ordered John to appear before him to explain, but John never appeared, and instead war was declared. By 1206, John lost Normandy and his mother's inheritance lands of Anjou, Maine, and parts of Poitou. Eleanor had died in 1204. In order to win back the lost territories, John raised punitive taxes from England and demanded in full his feudal rights, making him ever more unpopular. He quarrelled badly with the Church over the appointment of the Archbishop of Canterbury, which led Pope Innocent III in 1207 to impose an interdict on England, meaning no church services or rituals, such as the last rites, in the hope and expectation that the people of England would rise up against their king. John seized all church property in response, and even after 3 years, the people did not rebel. So in November 1209, John was excommunicated, and England threatened with a crusade led by Philip II Augustus, who would put his son Louis on the throne. Knowing his rebellious barons would likely support the crusade, John submitted to the Pope, made England a papal fief, and won the Pope's support against the barons. Civil war broke out in May 1215. The rebels seized London, and John was forced to negotiate from a position of weakness. On June 15th, the 2 sides met at Runnymede on Charter Island in the River Thames, and there King John agreed to limits on his power as king and pledged to respect feudal rights and English law in a document called the Magna Carta, signed on June 18th, 1215. A very famous document, of course, housed at the British Library. I think the 2 sides soon fell out again, and the barons invited Prince Louis of France to England to become king. John's armies laid waste to the north of England and areas around the border with Scotland, and while returning south, John took a route around the marshy Wash to avoid rebel-held East Anglia, but sent his slow baggage train, which was carrying the crown jewels, directly across the sands. The incoming tide swept away the baggage train, causing John considerable anguish. His health and state of mind suffered, and he fell sick to a bout of dysentery. He died at Newark Castle on October the 18th and was buried at Worcester Cathedral. Without the main protagonist in the Civil War, a compromise peace was soon reached, which restored their rights to the barons, who switched their allegiance to John's 9-year-old son Henry, instead of the foreigner Louis. And as a result, we have Henry III, ruled 1216 to 1272, whose reign was characterised by continuous strife and civil war with the barons and repeated failure to recapture lost French lands. His French rival Louis was also a proclaimed king by a majority of disgruntled barons, but the rebels quickly realised that Henry, advised and guided by his regents, William Marshal, the first Earl of Pembroke, and Hubert de Burgh, the first Earl of Kent, would be a better option. The French were quickly thrown out of London, and the Channel ports and order was restored in England. Throughout his teenage years, Henry was anxious to become king in his own right and re-establish the Anglo-Norman autocratic monarchy, something his barons were equally anxious to avoid. Aged 19 in 1227, Henry reached his majority and assumed power, but kept kept de Burgh as his chief advisor. In January 1236, Henry married the beautiful Eleanor of Provence, and together they had 5 children. Although generally unpopular, he ruled for 56 years. One of Henry's greatest mistakes was instrumental in alienating the barons even further was appointing his and his wife's French relatives to positions of power and importance. Added to this, repeated expensive and futile attempts to regain the lost lands proved disastrous. The English barons were deeply unhappy about foreign influence in the country and rallied around Simon de Montfort in rebellion. In essence, they wanted to return to the laws of Magna Carta and more powers for themselves. And finally, in 1258, Henry was forced by 7 barons to sign and swear an oath to uphold the provisions of Oxford, which abolished the absolutist Anglo-Norman monarchy and established a privy council of 15 barons to advise the king and oversee the legislature and administration, and the gathering of a parliament 3 times a year. The following year, the provisions of Westminster also attempted to control the king and establish common law. Within 2 years, the king broke his word with a papal bull exempting him, and the Second Barons' War broke out. Following the Battle of Lewes in May 1264, Henry and his son Edward, later Edward I, were captured and placed under house arrest, and de Montfort assumed government. After 15 months, Edward escaped his captors while hunting and led his supporters to victory against de Montfort at the Battle of Evesham. De Montfort was killed and a new government set up. In 1267, in the Statute of Marlborough, Henry promised to uphold Magna Carta and some of the provisions of Westminster. Here is a gold coin showing Henry III with orb and sceptre, and here is Henry II, Richard I, John and Henry III, from Matthew Paris's Historia Anglorium, 1250, kept at the British Library. Henry died in 1272, aged 65, after reigning for 56 years. He was eventually buried in Westminster Abbey. Under his aegis, Westminster had become the primary seat of power in England. We then have Edward I Longshanks, 1272 to 1307. Here is Edward I from a stained-glass window. Born in Westminster Palace, he was the son of Henry III and Eleanor of Provence, who made sure he had a thorough and disciplined education. He almost died aged 7, but was nursed through illness by his mother at Beaulieu Abbey. When aged 15, in November 1254, he journeyed to Spain, where he married his second cousin, who were both descendants of Henry II, Leonora of Castile. It proved a love match. They had 16 children together. That sounds exhausting. To provide him with an income, his father gave him the Duchy of Gascony, which included the Channel Islands, lands in Wales, and part of Ireland. In 1270, Edward, with his wife Eleanor and brother Edmund, joined King Louis IX and the Eighth Crusade to raise the siege of Acre and relieve the Christian garrison and recover the Holy Land. To fund the trip, a levy of 1/20 of every citizen's goods and possessions was imposed. The party spent the winter in Sicily and arrived in Palestine in May 1271. Louis IX died of plague in Tunis, but Edward decided to continue the crusade. While in the Holy Land in June 1272, he narrowly escaped an assassination attempt by a member of the assassins equipped with a poisoned dagger employed by one of the emirs. He managed a miraculous recovery, and a 10-year truce between the Muslims and Christians of Acre was negotiated, despite Edward's objections. Edward was still in the Holy Land when his father died, leaving him unopposed King of England in November 1272, but he didn't reach London until August 1274, when he was crowned at Westminster Abbey, aged 35. Initially calling himself Edward IV, he quickly changed this to become Edward I. At his first Parliament in the Statute of Westminster, he legislated on the laws of England to refine and bring them up to date. Then in 1274 ordered a countrywide survey into the usurpation of crown lands and rights which had been lost during the upheavals of his father's reign. He was an ambitious king, and once he had England under control, resolved to conquer the numerous princedoms of Wales. 1277 led his army into North Wales, where he forced the surrender of Llewellyn ap Gruffudd, Prince of Gwynedd, at the Treaty of Aberconwy in 1277. The same year, his brother led a rebellion against the English and was initially successful, but he was killed at the Battle of Irfon Bridge in 1282. In 1290, Queen Eleanor caught a fever and died in Nottinghamshire. Edward was devastated at her loss and ordered a memorial cross to be erected at every spot her body rested on in its journey back to London. 3 still survive at Geddington, Northampton and Waltham, and in name only at Charing Cross in London. I live very close to Waltham Cross, and I also know that there are memorials in Dunstable, near where I grew up, marking the site of a cross. At the age of 60, he remarried in September 1299, choosing the 17-year-old Margaret of France, the daughter of Philip III of France, and together they had 3 children. In Scotland, King Alexander III died, leaving his granddaughter Margaret as sole heir, but she died in Orkney on her way to England when she was due to marry Edward, Prince of Wales. The Scottish lords then asked Edward to arbitrate between the rival candidates. Edward took full advantage of this situation to ensure that the Scottish king paid fealty to the English crown. He chose John de Balliol, who became an English puppet, and the Scottish lords rose in revolt. Edward sent his army to Scotland in 1296. The border town of Berwick-upon-Tweed was stormed, and then the army moved north into Scotland. King John was captured and sent to the Tower of London. And at the same time, the Stone of Scone, the ancient coronation stone of Scotland, was taken to Westminster Abbey. It was returned 700 years later in 1996. The new Scottish opponent was William Wallace, who fought in the name of King John with the support of the clans but not the Scottish nobles. He secured a notable victory at Stirling Bridge, but was defeated by Edward I at Falkirk, although he escaped to fight again. 3 bishops, 3 regents were appointed to rule Scotland: the Bishop of St Andrews, John Comyn, and Robert the Bruce. Wallace appeared again at Stirling Castle in 1304, but was taken by his own countrymen and handed over to the English, who hung, drew, and quartered him. Robert the Bruce murdered his rival John Comyn and was crowned King of the Scots, and attempted to turn the tide against the English invaders. Edward again returned to Scotland at the head of his army, but he died at Burgh-on-Sands in July 1307 at the age of 68. He was buried at Westminster Abbey. Here he is in his role as Duke of Aquitaine, paying homage to Philip IV of France. Here we have Edward II, ruled from 1307 to 1327. Here bishops and monks are in audience with Edward I, and to the left, Edward I and Eleanor of Castile presenting their infant son, the future Edward II, to the Welsh in 1284. The reign of Edward II saw a constant wrestling for control of England between the king and his favourites on one side and the powerful barons on the other. Disliked by his queen and his people, Edward's openly homosexual friendships would not have brought him down had he not lavished them with titles, lands, and authority. Edward was born the 4th son of Edward I and Eleanor of Castile at Carnarvon Castle in Wales. He was the first Englishman to become Prince of Wales, and all well educated in statecraft and military matters, as befitted a future king. He had no interest in them, preferring more workmanlike pursuits. His overbearing father also detested his closest friend, the Gascon knight Piers Gaveston, and exiled him to France. When his father died, one of Edward's first moves was to recall Piers Gaveston from exile. He also abandoned the campaigns against the Scots and aligned himself dynastically to King Philip IV of France by marrying his daughter Isabella. In Boulogne, in January 1308, although their marriage was far from close, they had 2 sons, Edward and John, and 2 daughters, Eleanor and Joanna. While he was in France, Edward left Gaveston as regent, and scandalously conferred on him the royal title of Earl of Cornwall and his niece Margaret of Gloucester in marriage. This hugely unpopular move undermined Edward's popularity with his subjects, and in 1311 his outraged nobles issued the ordinances which attempted to limit the king's finances, control royal appointments, and banish Gaveston. The latter was exiled, but he returned quickly. In 1312, the Earl of Lancaster and his allies seized and beheaded Gaveston in Warwickshire, but without the king's favourite as a focus, the barons quickly fell out, and a furious Edward was able to force the Earls of Lancaster, Hereford, Arundel and Warwick to beg his pardon. The Scottish king Robert the Bruce was making trouble in the north, so Edward sent an invading army, but was decisively beaten at the Battle of Bannockburn in 1314. A humbled Edward lost his power and authority to the barons, who looked to Thomas of Lancaster, his cousin, for leadership, and was effectively King of England by 1350. Under his custody, much of the country returned to local anarchy. Here are medieval statues of the Edwards First, Second, and Third, and he was the first monarch to found colleges at Oxford and Cambridge universities. Edward II was probably murdered by his enemies, but he was still buried in a magnificent tomb in Gloucester. By 1318, Edward and Thomas had reached a working rapprochement until Edward promoted his two new favourites, Hugh le Despencer and his son. Their greed and corruption disgusted all, and they were forced into exile as civil war broke out. Edward defeated Lancaster in battle at Boroughbridge in March 1322 and executed him. The Despensers were recalled, and Edward then shared his royal authority with them. Largely ignored by her husband, Isabella of France was supported by the barons. In 1325 she was sent on a diplomatic mission to France, and while there met and became the mistress of Roger Mortimer, another of Edward's exiled barons, and together they assembled an army of 1,500 mercenaries and invaded England in September 1326 to general acclaim. The Despensers were captured and executed, and Edward was forced to renounce his throne in favour of his and Isabella's son Edward. The former king was imprisoned in Berkeley Castle and was probably murdered there. We now have Edward III, who ruled 1327 to 1377. A great soldier and leader, his reign saw the start of the interminable series of conflicts and wars between England and France that later became known as the 100 Years' War. Initially acclaimed, the foreign campaigning, which necessitated high taxes, made England increasingly unpopular over the latter part of his 50-year reign. And also the Black Death, which was seen as God's curse, struck 3 times, in 1348 to 49, 1361 to 62, and 1369. There's little known about his early years other than his parents were Edward II and Isabella of France, and he became king at the age of 14 when his mother and her lover, the arrogant and greedy Roger Mortimer, Earl of March, forced Edward II to renounce the throne in his favour. The pair then ruled as joint regents until 1330, when Edward, aged 17, staged a coup and took over. He exiled his mother to Castle Rising in Norfolk and executed Mortimer for usurping the throne. In 1328, while still a minor, he married Philippa of Hainault, and together they had 13 children. He had no known illegitimate children, and in 1337 he created the Duchy of Cornwall to provide an independent income for his oldest son, a tradition which continues to this day. With the kingdom largely peaceful, Scotland largely quelled, and the barons under control, Edward's primary concerns were the former French territories, which had once belonged to the English crown. In 1337, Philip VI had confiscated Aquitaine and Ponthieu, and 2 years later Edward and his army invaded France, and the following year he provocatively assumed the title of King of France and started what became known as the 100 Years' War between France and England. In July 1346, he invaded Normandy, accompanied by his son Edward, the Black Prince, and 15,000 men. Here's an image of Edward III taking the city of Caen in 1346, and here is an image of Edward III. Looks very wizard-like in that image, I would say. They triumphed at the Battle of Crécy and went on to capture the vital channel port of Calais, which they used as their military base for French campaigns. The war restarted in 1355, and in the following year the Black Prince not only won a magnificent victory at Poitiers, but also captured King John II of France. A peace was negotiated, in which Edward renounced his claim to the French crown in return for Aquitaine, and signed to that effect the Treaty of Bretigny, giving Edward control of almost a quarter of France. This ended the first phase of the 100 Years' War. Here's an image of Edward III from a copy of an anonymous portrait at Hampton Court. And below here is Richard II, who we'll talk about in a moment. In 1369, the French declared war again. Edward was by then too old to lead his armies, which he left to his sons. They soon lost almost all of the territorial gains of 1360, only holding on to Calais and a piece of coast near Bordeaux and Bayonne. At home in England, the military losses, the expense of the campaigns and crippling taxation, and the outbreak of plague led to a crisis which was furthered when the death of Queen Philippa in 1369 saw the old king falling under the malign influence of his mistress, Alice Perez. For about this time onwards he fell increasingly ill and played little active part in ruling the country. In 1376 the Good Parliament was called to rectify the situation, and the corruption of the court was criticised and the heavy taxes condemned. Alice Perez was banished from court, but to make matters worse, the death of the Black Prince, heir to the throne, was announced. This left John of Gaunt, Edward's younger son and regent in his absence, as the next king. He died at age 64 at Sheen Palace in Surrey in June 1377, naming his grandson Richard as king, which saw the coronation of Richard II from 1377 to 1399. So this reign saw a 28-year truce in the 100 Years' War, although there were constant threats of a French invasion. At home he started out popular. His closest friends and chosen advisors, his extravagant court, his absolutionist attitude made him unpopular with the public at large, though, and the nobility in particular. Following the terrible toll of the Black Death in 1381, and 3 poll taxes levied to pay for the military campaigns in France, the peasantry of England had had enough. The peasants' revolt was led by Wat Tyler and demanded the abolition of serfdom. The kingdom was briefly threatened until the young king rode out to Smithfield to meet the rebels. Compromise couldn't be reached, but Tyler was taken and killed, and the revolt collapsed over the next few weeks as Richard granted clemency to the rebels. Once the danger of rebellion had disappeared, he revoked the freedoms and pardons. In January 1882, Richard made a politically expedient marriage to Anne of Bohemia, daughter of the Holy Roman Emperor Charles IV. The union wasn't popular in England, and Anne brought no dowry. Rather, Richard had to give 20,000 florins to her brother. Anne died of plague, childless, in 1394. In family tradition, Richard wanted to fight in France to regain the lost lands, but Parliament refused to cooperate unless he got rid of his unpopular advisers, principally Michael de la Pole, Earl of Suffolk, and Robert de Vere, Earl of Oxford. Richard refused, and in response Parliament impeached the Earl of Suffolk and established a commission to oversee and regulate the king's decisions and activities. The government was taken over by the Lords Appellant, a move Richard declared to be treasonous. In 1388, the merciless Parliament outlawed Richard's closest friends and executed a number, leaving Richard no option but to submit to the demands of the 5 lords. But by May 1389, Richard was back in command of his government, promising to reduce taxation and seek peace with France. And for 8 years the reconciliation held. As part of the peace, Richard married Isabella of Valois, the daughter of Charles VI of France. Here is an image of Richard II and St. John the Baptist at Winchester College Chapel. By 1397, Richard had sufficient support to move against his enemies, and he arrested and tried 3 of the appellants. Arundel was convicted of treason and executed. Gloucester was imprisoned and subsequently murdered, and Warwick banished. Parliament was reduced to an advisory role, as Richard pocketed all the revenues of state. He further strengthened his position the following fall when Henry Bolingbroke, Earl of Derby, and Thomas de Mowbray quarrelled, and Richard banished them both. In February 1399, John of Gaunt died, and Richard confiscated his vast duchy of Lancaster estate so they could not pass to his heir Bolingbroke. Instead, he gave them to his favourites. Then, in May, Richard left to campaign in Ireland. With Richard and his army absent, Bolingbroke seized his opportunity and invaded northern England in June 1399 to reclaim his inheritance and quickly gathered support. Richard returned to England in August and surrendered without a fight. He abdicated in September, and Bolingbroke took the crown as Henry IV. In October, Richard was imprisoned in Pontefract Castle, but when popular risings in support of him threatened the peace, he died aged 33 in mysterious circumstances, probably murdered in February 1400. He was buried in Westminster Abbey. That leads us on to the new House of Lancaster with Henry IV of Bolingbroke. So this is a good opportunity to pause and end part 3. So thank you very much for joining me on this softly spoken read through of the British Kings and Queens. I look forward to having you join me next time. And until then, Goodbye.